this is Dr. Ron Klatz, president and founder of the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. And it's my great pleasure to bring you a staple of the Academy, one of our most highly recognized and appreciated speakers and presenters, Dr. David Perlmutter. He's going to bring to us some very new information from his newest book, Dropping Acid. Dr. Perlmutter's thesis is that uric acid is not our friend, and I'm looking forward to hearing that. And please recall that the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine is the world's largest preventive medicine society, with over 26,000 members in 135 countries around the world. And we are working every day to make your life a longer, healthier, happier one. And without ado, my guest, Carol Petersen, PhD, PharmD. She's joining me as a co-host, and our guest, Dr. Dave Perlmutter. Welcome, Dave.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, Ron.
I'd like to just introduce Dr. Perlmutter to our audience for Immortality Now. Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist. He actually went to medical school at the University of Miami. He's quite the author and has really got a lot of renown for his book, Grain Brain, and he's got affiliated books to go with that. And now he has taken a whole new track and has the book Drop Acid. We wanted to catch up with him and find out about this new rabbit hole he's ready to take us down. Welcome to Immortality Now, Dr. Perlmutter. And what's the acid that we need to be concerned about?
Well, let me go back to a bit of the introduction where we were told that uric acid is not our friend. And I think context is actually very, very important, because uric acid has been and really is our friend, has been our friend for an awful long time. Throughout our ancestry, those with the highest levels of uric acid would survive. It's actually a survival mechanism, because in our past, when food was not as abundant as it is now, survival was granted to those who had a superpower. The superpower was having a slightly higher uric acid that translated to just a little bit more body fat and a higher level of blood sugar, a little bit of insulin resistance, higher levels of inflammation. All of the things that we now recognize in our time of food abundance do not serve us well and are really the things that we are trying to get away from, as it were. But make no mistake about it, having elevated uric acid, which we are all at risk for, took place in our primate ancestry millions of years ago during a time of aggressive food scarcity, during what is called the Middle Miocene period. And our ancestors who had mutations in the enzyme that makes uric acid, that breaks it down, so therefore they had higher levels of uric acid, they again had this superpower in that they made they didn't become obese, but they made just enough fat to get through the winter to survive during times of food scarcity. And it's only today, when we are targeting those pathways that stimulate uric acid production, and we'll certainly talk about them, that it's working against us. So it's really an example of what we call an evolutionary environmental mismatch. We can't affect the evolutionary part of it, that's our genome, but the environment, how we challenge our genome, is certainly up for grabs in terms of being something we can leverage, something we can control to have a better outcome and achieve a longer and healthier life, that's for sure.
Why do we have so much trouble with uric acid now? Why are those things working against us in this day and time? The hypertension, the insulin resistance, and we're pretty aware of that. And we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. Why isn't it serving us now?
It's a really good question. And I think I've decided a few weeks ago that this topic that we're going to discuss right now will be the topic of my next book that I'm going to call it Mismatch, because it's the mismatch between our heritage and the world around us today, not just in terms of the foods that we eat, but all aspects of our environment aren't really lining up with what our genome has prepared us to deal with. And interestingly, I've been thinking about this, and I wrote about this. My first paper on this topic I published half a century ago, believe it or not, in the Miami Herald when I was 16. And I asked the question, what about us living today who are trying to survive with this outdated machinery? You know, machinery, our bodies, our physiology, dictated by our DNA, that really is more suited to a different time, a different set of circumstances. So we raise our uric acid in response to particular signals. And primarily, the biggest signal certainly active today is something called fructose, a type of sugar, fructose meaning derived from fruit. And fructose, the likes of which we've never seen before, is metabolized directly to uric acid, and that's an alarm signal for the body saying, make and store fat, raise the blood sugar, develop insulin resistance, and raise the blood pressure, all because in our past, those things were good to have. It was good to raise your blood sugar when you couldn't find food because it still allowed you to power your brain. It was good to raise your blood pressure a little bit when you were risking being dehydrated. And certainly having a little bit extra body fat served as a storage depot for calories when food was less abundant. There are only three things that are metabolized into uric acid. They are fructose and alcohol and something called purines. Purines are the breakdown product of the DNA and RNA that are in our foods, also even in our body tissues. When we break down our own muscles, we create purines, and that contributes to the uric acid pool. But make no mistake about it, the uric acid level in humans is rising dramatically. In America in the 1920s, the average uric acid level was about 3.5 milligrams per deciliter. By 1970, it had risen to 6 milligrams per deciliter. What we now recognize is that anything over 5.5 begins to fairly dramatically increase the risk for cardiovascular disease and other metabolic issues that we will talk about. So the average even today is higher than it should be. You know, you go to your doctor and get a uric acid level. Typically, she or he will look at that uric acid level only in the context of something called gout. And at that evaluation, you will be told that if your uric acid level is 6, that's fine because the normal level is 7 or lower. But please understand that only relates to gout. Above a concentration of 7 milligrams per deciliter or higher, that's when the uric acid begins to precipitate out of the blood and form crystals. But its metabolic signaling threat occurs at much lower levels. And to be clear, having a high uric acid level is clearly associated with dramatic increased risk of, well, let me give you an example. One study published in 2008 looked at 90,000 individuals, 42,000 men and 48,000 women, followed them over an 8-year period of time. And what they found was that during the 8-year period and at the end of the study, those who had the highest level of uric acid had about a 38% increased risk of dying of cardiovascular disease. Matter of fact, they had a 16% increased risk of death from any cause whatsoever. We call that all-cause mortality. And they had a 35% increased risk of dying of a stroke. Interestingly, for every point elevation above 7, they had an additional 8 to 13% increased risk of, again, all-cause mortality. And, you know, I'm certainly not the first person you've interviewed. And, you know, the dedication of A4M has been, over the years, the prolongation, not just prolongation of life, but the prolongation of a healthy life. When we see these statistics showing that elevation of a particular marker, in this case, uric acid, is associated with such a dramatic foreshortening of life, we got to take notice of this and really broaden our understanding of uric acid well beyond its very simplistic role in being related to gout.
Dr. Perlmutter? Mother, at what point should one take action to try and lower their uric acid levels? I was completely surprised when I started hearing your presentations on the issue. As someone who suffered from gout in the past, I thought anything under 6 was a-okay, and I've certainly become asymptomatic once my uric acid levels drop below 6. But from what you're saying, that's not a safe point. And I was also told or taught from my readings that uric acid is a natural antioxidant, and that people had higher levels of uric acid were protected from aging-related disorders. And that doesn't seem to be the case with what you're saying.
Well, it really isn't. Intracellularly, actually, uric acid is a very potent pro-oxidant. In the blood, it does have some antioxidant potential, that's for sure. But intracellularly, as it relates to the goings-on of metabolism and mitochondrial function, elevated uric acid is by far and away a powerful pro-oxidant and therefore deserves our attention. So when you lower your uric acid when you have gout and you no longer have gout, though the uric acid is still elevated, you are labeled as having something called asymptomatic hyperuricemia, meaning you don't have gout anymore, therefore it's not a big deal. Well, the truth of the matter is, one Japanese study showed that your risk of hypertension is significantly increased, as is your risk for dyslipidemia and obesity, even though you're not getting gout flare-ups anymore, though the uric acid level is still elevated. So in many ways, it's like elevated blood sugar, elevated blood pressure. It's sort of a silent killer in that, you don't have gout crystals forming in your great toe anymore, and therefore you've forgotten about it. It's important to get that uric acid level down. And, again, we liked to pigeonhole, pardon me?
Down. Are we talking about 3, 2, 1, 0?
Getting our uric acid levels low.
Yeah.
I think getting your levels much lower is good. I mean, I check my uric acid level at home. There's a monitor a person can get, and you can check it just like you check your blood sugar. And there's my most recent level. I think that's 4.7. And this is a simple finger stick. Of course, you can go to a regular lab or go to the doctor's office to have a blood draw in the morning and see what it is. But I don't think there's really a significant lower level that you would be concerned. And these days, as mentioned, even the average person walking around, adult, has an elevated uric acid level. Look, the average American is metabolically unfit. 88% of Americans, 88% of American adults have at least one parameter of the metabolic syndrome. That means only 1 in 8 American adults now is metabolically intact or healthy. So this becomes yet another powerful tool in our toolbox, along with measuring BMI, measuring fasting blood sugar and fasting blood insulin, measuring blood pressure. This becomes a really important metric. An interesting study was published in 2016, collaborative study with Turkish and Japanese researchers called Uric Acid in Metabolic Syndrome, from innocent bystander to a central player. And it's a great title because it really engenders this notion that we have looked upon elevated uric acid in association with hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity, hyperglycemia for such a long time. We've seen it all, and we've sort of said, well, isn't that interesting? No big deal. The person doesn't have gout. But now, as we've seen the science evolve and we've seen the mechanisms whereby uric acid can cause these problems, indeed, it is justified to call it a central player in these metabolic problems. In fact, another big paper came out in May of 2022 that really solidified our understanding that it's playing a functional role here. It's an alarm signal telling your body winter is coming. You're not going to have food. Make and store fat.
I have a couple of questions about fat. I listened to the explanation you had for the camel's hump and hydration. body water. I was astounded to hear this, and I think it's worthwhile for everybody to know. And along with that is there a healthy body weight for successful aging? Can you be too skinny, too fat? And how do we know where that is? And what about salt? You also talked about in a previous post, you talked about salt can have a negative effect. So how does this all twine in together?
Your first and last questions actually go together quite handily. And we'll start with the salt and work backwards to the fat.
Mhm.
When we eat a lot of salt and are not drinking enough water to go with it, when we're eating the salty pretzels, watching the playoffs or whatever it may be, we actually do transiently raise our serum sodium. And an elevation, even though mild, of our serum sodium is a powerful signal telling the body that we are becoming dehydrated. If you can't find water, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you can't find water, your serum sodium goes up. If you are brought to the hospital emergency room and you're dehydrated and they check your electrolytes, they'll see your serum sodium is elevated. Well, we know that when we're dehydrated and our sodium is elevated, we activate various enzymatic pathways. One of them is to make more vasopressin, antidiuretic hormones, so that we don't lose fluid. It's telling our bodies we're in trouble. The other thing that the elevated sodium does is it activates another pathway called the polyol pathway that converts your blood sugar into fructose that makes uric acid, that makes you put on more fat. Now, this is more of a chronic problem when you're trying to find water day in and day out. You make more body fat, and that might not seem to make a lot of sense. And that gets back to our first analogy, which is the camel. Why does it have a hump? The reason the camel has a hump and can go 3 weeks with no water and walking across the desert in 110 degrees, whatever it is because when the camel and when you and I burn fat, we create two things: carbon dioxide, which we exhale, and water. We call this metabolic water. So body fat is a resource, a storage depot for creating water. Yes, calories, we get that. We've understood that. But it's also how we make water. Whales don't stop along the way for a drink at an underwater spring. They have a lot of blubber that they use for insulation. They use it for calories, and they use it so their bodies can make water for normal metabolism. So that's the reason that letting our serum sodiums get elevated, even transiently and even mildly, is a worrisome thing, is because that creates fructose in our bodies, even though we may be very judicious in terms of how much fructose we are consuming.
Wow. So can you be too skinny or too fat? Or what if you are overweight? Would this be a technique to restrict water intake to force your body to burn fat?
Well, no. I mean, if you restrict water, you're going to actually keep your body from burning fat, and you're going to be working against yourself. Clearly, you can be too heavy, and clearly, you can be too thin. But there are two really important pathways that I think are worthy of discussion that regulate our metabolism. And I think many of your viewers are familiar with the first one, which is something called AMP kinase, AMPK. And when we activate our AMPK metabolic pathway, it's telling our bodies something very simple: the hunting is good. It means we don't need to store fat. The hunting is good. Burn the fat. We don't need to raise the blood sugar because there's plenty of food. So therefore, this process of gluconeogenesis, creating new blood sugar from the liver, doesn't have to happen. And it allows our metabolism to work optimally, to burn energy optimally. It's when we are fat burning that we are activating our AMP kinase. That's what we want to do. It's the reason we exercise. Physical exercise is one of the most powerful ways that we can activate AMPK. We could also activate it with supplements like quercetin is pretty powerful in terms of activating AMP kinase. It's how the drug metformin works through AMP kinase to turn down our body's production of glucose in the liver. Berberine as well is like a metformin mimetic, stimulates this AMP kinase. But guess what? AMP kinase has an evil twin. And the evil twin of AMP kinase is called AMP deaminase, or AMPD. And when AMPD is activated, then we are not burning fat, we are making fat, and we are storing fat. And we are slowing down our metabolic metabolism, our burning of fuel to help us survive. And we are creating glucose to power the brain. Uric acid favors the evil twin. It shuts down AMP kinase and tells our body AMP deaminase is what we're going to be using. We're going to essentially be like a bear getting ready to hibernate. We're going to make as much fat as we possibly can, and we're going to turn down oxidative metabolism. So therefore, we're not going to burn that fuel. We're going to be able to conserve the fuel. And that's how the bear survives during its hibernation. We don't want to do that unless people are getting ready to hibernate. We don't need to be packing away body fat because clearly calories are abundant. We're not going to run short, and therefore we don't need to be storing our fat, making more fat, storing more fat. We need our metabolic activity to be high so we can burn the fat. We don't need to make more blood sugar. We sure don't need to raise our blood pressure as a hedge against dehydration either.
Dr. Perlmutter, what I understand you to say then is that elevated uric acid, which occurs on a large percentage of the elderly population, is a risk factor for aging. And that's not good. And we should try and get as close to a level of 3 milligrams per deciliter in our blood tests. Yes.
Yes, I think having a level around 3 or 4 would be wonderful. Now,
okay. In order to accomplish that goal, should we be using pharmaceutical products? Should we be using allopurinol or probenecid, or perhaps another anti-uric acid drug? Or should we be doing all natural?
Well, I think that is a personalized medicine question. And I think that the inhibition of the enzyme that is the final enzyme involved in uric acid production, it's called xanthine oxidase. That's where the drugs work. That's where the allopurinol, the febuxostat, they work. They target that enzyme. It's also where quercetin works. As a matter of fact, quercetin is almost as effective in terms of inhibiting that enzyme as is allopurinol. So studies have demonstrated, one study done in England at Oxford looked at 22 young men, recent study, put them on quercetin 500 milligrams a day for 8 weeks and dropped their uric acid with no other changes in diet or lifestyle whatsoever by 8% in just 8 weeks. So you can do it naturally. You can couple that with the dietary approaches that we've been talking about or alluding to. But there may be a time in people who have real high levels of uric acid, perhaps because of their genetic predisposition, having a polymorphism of the URAT1 gene locus, perhaps, who just have very, very high uric acids, and they might need a pharmaceutical intervention. We like to keep blood sugars under control without drugs. Do we use drugs for patients with high blood sugar? You bet we do. You bet we do use high blood pressure medications when we are trying to get someone's blood pressure under control. So I think there's certainly a time and a place for pharmaceutical intervention across the spectrum of metabolic dysfunction. The goal, of course, is primum non nocere, above all, do no harm. And the dietary modifications and the use of things like quercetin and luteolin are really far lower in terms of risk than the pharmaceutical interventions. I will say, though, that allopurinol seems to turn out to be a pretty safe drug if that's a route that somebody may need to choose.
Very good. And just to sum things up, this, after all, is Immortality Now. And I'm really happy to have an opportunity to get your own personal thoughts and your experiences. What do you see that's available today that was not available in the last few years? New therapies that might have a direct impact on quality of life and quantity of life in the anti-aging medicine realm. Anything that really strikes you as something that you want to incorporate yourself and maybe recommend to your patients?
Sure. And it's actually a very easy question because there's been a huge trend over the past 5 years and growing of personal empowerment with information, and to give people the ability to harvest information about themselves, relevant information, important, actionable information, I think has been a sea change in the world of health and longevity. For example, continuous glucose monitors, for example, being made available to people, wearing various devices, wearable devices that can give you insight as to your quality and quantity of sleep, another example. I think these are major advances in terms of empowerment that lead to action that are going to have and are already having a dramatic impact on health of individuals who avail themselves of these types of technology.
I agree with you entirely, and I'm looking at even more artificial intelligence enabled wearable devices, not for the purpose of monitoring us for Google or for some other party, but for our own health. That is on a closed loop system where we're not releasing this information to the rest of the world, but simply being able to monitor your own vital signs and your own physiologic parameters is a huge benefit and will bear fruit into the future.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perlmutter. Dave, your input is always valuable, and congratulations on your book. And this topic is, it's a head turner. And I really love
good.
the field, and I really like what you have to say. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. On behalf of the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, I want to wish all of our listeners a healthy, happy, longer lifespan. And David, do you have a copy of your book that you can hold up so that
I do, as a matter of fact, but I think it's probably going to be backwards. There you go.
No, it's good.
Oh, good. Well,
the
cherry there is because one of the
hold it up. People may want to buy your book. I certainly do.
Oh, good. Well, the reason there's a cherry there, I just was going to say, is because that cherry in the drop of drop acid signifies the fact that tart cherries have long been used in gout therapy. It works quite handily to, again, inhibit that enzyme, xanthine oxidase, and lower uric acid. So we got a little clever with the cover there.
Well, that's great. And what is your website address for people who want to?
Sure. It's very simple. It's drperlmutter.com, drperlmutter.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us. And
absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
God bless.
Thank you.